May the words of my heart and the meditations of our lives give praise to you, Lord God. Amen. Okay, you that know me know that I either can see you or I can read, and sometimes I can't do reading at all because my eyes water all the time. So we're going to have a conversation. This is one of the steps that we've been asked to listen to and think about these last 5 or 6 weeks about the way of love. The presiding bishop has outlined a course of ways of love, and today the topic is go. And when I saw that that was the topic, that's the one I wanted. So that's the one I got to do. I love this topic because it is about trying to discern where we are to go and who we are to be in this world. And I want you to look at the sign in front of where I'm standing that says we are to love everybody, the people who are different from us, the people who believe differently, the people who love differently, the people who are different in all the different ways people are different. We are to love everyone, and that includes everyone. No exceptions. If we're to live into this gospel, we are to love everyone. Now, that also involves listening to calls. And I love the first reading because Jonah, before this reading, in this reading, Jonah's told to go and tell Nineveh they need to change their ways or they're going to all get smited and killed because they're not doing what God wants them to do. Well, but before that, Jonah is told to go to Nineveh, and he doesn't want to go, and so he says no to God. And then we hear about Jonah getting swallowed by this big fish and living for 3 days in the stomach, in the belly of this whale. And the whale spits him out after 3 days. And then again, God says, go to Nineveh and give them this message. Jonah has learned his lesson. He says, yes, I'll go. He doesn't like the Nineveh people. He doesn't care if they get saved. In fact, I think he'd rather that they didn't. Somehow they're different from him, and he doesn't approve of them. But the people in Nineveh listen to Jonah when he goes, and they repent, and God's compassion is moved by their repentance, and they are saved. But it's a good example of an unwilling following of God. Sometimes we need to get swallowed by a whale to listen, but that doesn't happen to us in these days. And then there is the story of the Good Samaritan. The young man who's asking God, what is the way and how am I to be saved? He knows the answer. Love God with his whole heart, with his whole being, and every part of himself. If you do that, you will be saved. But he says, but what else should I be doing? I think he wants a higher place up there. He doesn't want to just get in. He wants to be at the top. So he's asking, what else can I do? And Jesus tells him the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's not enough. And in that parable, there are 3 people who go by. The poor man who's been beaten and robbed and left half dead. And the Good Samaritan comes along, and he's the one who has compassion. He doesn't know this man. He doesn't identify with this man. Who knows who he is, what faith he is, whether he's clean or dirty, or all of the different things that were going on at this time. What he knows is this man is in need, and the Samaritan's heart is moved to meet that need. That's huge. Not only does he meet the need, but he covers the cost of meeting that need. He goes back and will pay the innkeeper, whatever you have to spend, take care of this man, do what I can't do right now, and I will come back and pay you. I think we are all called to be the Good Samaritan. We are challenged in our life to be that person for other people. Now, I have a number of friends that I've known for decades visiting today because they wanted to hear me preach. And I want to use an example of them in this service because I think people find us. They come into our lives not by accident. And a lot of times we don't know how they find us, but they do. Now, John, you'll remember the night you all were having Bible study in my living room, and I came home after many hours of there is a woman from Ghana sitting in my office waiting to see me, speaking not a word of English, but clearly not going to leave until I see her. And I speak none of her language. She doesn't speak English, but I know people who do speak her language. So I called the medical mission sisters, and I found somebody who had worked in Ghana who could talk to her and tell me what it was she was asking for. And it was a simple thing. Her daughter was very, very ill in Ghana, and $200 would save her life. Without that, her daughter was going to die. There was no question of that. And I asked my sister friend in Philadelphia, does this make sense to you? And she said yes. And I said, then that's easy. $200 to save somebody's life? That's a no-brainer. So I gave her the money and sent her on her way, and I think her daughter's life was saved but she came into my life. There are also other people that find you. When you've been working with homeless, you become known in the community. And one of my hopes, let me back up a second. In our forum today, we were talking about all the big issues in our world today, and how do we look at what can we do to change the disparity of the poor, the people who have, and the people who don't have. And my dream for that would be to look at people adopting people. When I was in seminary, I worked at Mount Vernon Place United Methodist Church. And at first, I didn't want to go work there because my orientation and why I went to seminary was to get ordained to be a priest on the street, to work with homeless people. That was the call. That was the call in my heart for many, many years. And I was finally getting to realize that call. And I get called to this church with everybody in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I think, wow, this is going to be... But it was the only place that wanted me and that would take me, so guess what? I went. Reluctantly, just as Jonah was. And I found it to be the most amazing place because across the street from it was this trailer camp for homeless men. And they were semi-trailers outfitted with 3 levels of bunk beds, 3 long, 3 on the ground floor, 3 in the middle, and 3 on the top. Not great housing, but it was housing hundreds of poor, homeless men. And the first thing they asked me to do was to become their priest. I didn't even know they were there when I went to work at Mount Vernon Place, but I got to be their priest. And I got to fall in love with this congregation because all of these retired men embraced these homeless men, one on either side, and worked with each one of them to get them into housing, to get them jobs, to dress them so they could go for interviews. They mentored them, and in 2 years we had 50 of those men were members of Mount Vernon Place. They served on every level of the church governance. They were solid members and in housing. And it was a wonderful example to me of how we can, one person at a time, change the world. It's a model that I hope more churches someday will embrace, because it feels overwhelming when there are so many people that are in need. But if every one of us chose one person to mentor, to walk on this journey with, what a difference that would make. What a difference, the ripple effect that would bring. Now, you all know Linda Kaufman and love her as I do. She's one of the priests here at St. Stephen's. And she did a video one time of Linda sitting here and one of the women, an African-American woman, sitting over across from her, and they talked about their life and the parallels of their life. Linda talked about her journey with alcoholism, and this other woman, I don't remember her name, unfortunately, but she talked about her journey with alcoholism. Linda talked about falling off the edge financially because of the alcoholism, and her brother paying her rent to keep her in a housing. And this woman had no family to fall back on in her crisis, and she became homeless. And their lives paralleled all the way through, with the primary difference being that there was no family fallback, no one who could pick up the little bit that was necessary to keep this woman in housing. It's a very powerful video, and I'm sure if you asked Linda, she would send you the link to that. But it was striking in how similar and how totally different their outcome was. They both got into recovery eventually, and Linda went on to go to seminary and have the most incredible life working with homeless in all of DC and around the country, heading up the housing program that's gotten over 200,000 people who are chronically homeless into housing. I believe the Christian message is that we're all called to do that. In whatever way or shape or form that might take, we are all called to be that support system. And, you know, I went this summer to work in Bangladesh to work with the Hague refugees, and people say, what difference did it make? Well, to the handful of women that I accompanied to a real hospital to get care for real needs when they were very, very sick, I made a huge difference. I made a huge difference in a handful of lives. To the doctors that I now continue to mentor and support and send resources to all the time, this internet is fabulous sometimes when I can get it to work, but that's making a difference. It's helping them not burn out in the incredibly overwhelming situation that they find themselves in. So my challenge is for you all to think about, how do you go into the world and love everybody that's different? One great gift I got from the Medical Mission Sisters was studying world religions for 3 years and realizing it's all the same God. Lots of different names, but it's all the same God. The same beliefs and tenets in all religions. We can have crazy Christians just as we can have crazy other religions. But the core truth of each faith is the same. Love and let your light shine so that you can be a healing presence in this wounded and broken world. When we think about where should we go, that discernment sometimes is not as easy as you might think. Jonah certainly had his experience of when he didn't follow God's call. And we all will experience that at times and struggle with, how do I know what is the right thing? Sometimes it is to stay planted right here and have eyes and ears and an open heart to see, where do I share my gifts? How do I make a difference in at least one person's life? If every one of us did that, imagine the ripple effect all over the world. It would make a huge difference. How do we hear that voice? We hear that in prayer. We hear it in silence. Sometimes we hear it in sermons. Sometimes we hear it in discerning with someone else what we are called to do, who we are called to be, how we are called to live into this life. It's exciting to be called. And it's exciting because when you feel that call real clearly. God makes it happen. I felt called to work with homeless, and I got into the ordination process because I wanted to be a priest on the street. And after 10 years of hoop jumping, I was told on a Tuesday morning at breakfast that the standing committee was going to turn me down after 10 years. And I went home and I railed at God. I thought, what in God's name has all of this been? I felt so clearly called. And after I railed for several hours, I get a call from Ernest Steinberg, who with her husband John had started N Street Village. And she said, I've been having a hard time finding you because I couldn't remember your last name, but Mount Vernon Place mentors made sure I met every person in the city who worked with homeless. And John and Erna were the stars of homeless work in D.C., back when no one else was doing it yet. And she said, I've been looking for you, and I don't know what you're doing, but I want you to, I'm asking you, would you be willing to put your name into the hat? And then she described exactly, almost word for word, what I had said to my spiritual director the week before when he kept pressing me. What are you called to do? And I said, well, I don't think they're going to ordain me if I tell them this, but I'm called to be a priest on the street. I'm called to work with chronically mentally ill. I'm called to work with the people who are dealing with addictions. I am called to be their priest. And that is exactly what Erna was asking me to do. And I realized God was right in the middle of all this. And I told Erna, I said, well, Erna, I just heard today that they're probably not going to ordain me. And her immediate response was, well, then we'll make you a Lutheran. And the skies opened up because it's all the same God. And she was calling me to do exactly what I had spent 10 years trying to do, all the hoop jumping, to be allowed to do that. I wanted to be a priest on the street, and she was asking me to do exactly that. It didn't matter what denomination. I was Roman Catholic, I've been an Episcopalian, I went to a Methodist seminary, I worked in a Methodist church. It's all the same God. It doesn't matter the denomination. And with that clarity, that affirmation, I went into my meeting with the standing committee and I didn't care anymore. And that was a huge lesson. Somewhere along that journey, somebody had said to me, Betsy, you care too much about this. And it never made sense to me. How can you care too much about following God's will? And I realized, because if you care and you feel it's all my work that's going to get me there, I'm forgetting who's in charge. And so at that meeting on that Wednesday morning, this committee that had decided they weren't going to ordain me called me in, put me out, called me back in. We went back and forth for about 6 or 7 hours, and they decided they would ordain me and that I could go ahead. And I thought, okay, now what do I do? But I knew God was in charge, and that's what gave me peace. And I had my first interview with the group at Luther Place, and it was a phone conference call because I was teaching out at Christ Church in Rockville that night, and I couldn't get to Luther Place. And the next day, I'm calling my contact there and say, well, give me some feedback, because, you know, having a very significant first interview and you can't see people's responses or their faces, I thought, how am I supposed to know what's happening? And she said, well, when they asked you what you thought it would be like to work with the Lutheran Church, and I said, oh, I think that would be great fun. You know, I'd been in all these other denominations. I thought it would be, and I did. I truly thought it would, because I know nothing about Lutherans. They were blown away because they take themselves very seriously. Very seriously. They don't think of themselves as fun, but they sure as hell see ministry the way I do. And they had put their lives on hold, working and working and working with the homeless to finally build this wonderful place called N Street Village. So my thinking it was fun was I knew I was in. I knew I had the job because it was exactly what I had been called to do. But I learned a lot about trusting that God will get you where you're supposed to go. God will put in your place what you're supposed to do. Sometimes you get knocked over by it. Sometimes you get swallowed by a whale. And sometimes you just sit in the quiet and stay planted and listen to see what is the next call that God is giving you and where are you to go. May you find great joy in experiencing your next call, whether it's to stay planted, to go somewhere, to do something different. But I pray that you will all listen with open hearts and an open spirit to hear God's call in your life. Amen.